To the Secretary of State for International Trade, Mr. Rainham Chishti.
Number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State for International Trade, Secretary Dr. Liam.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker, it's been so long. I met with Federal Councillor Guy Parmelin during my visit to Switzerland in February. Together we signed the UK-Switzerland trade agreement. It was an important moment, ensuring continuity of a trading relationship worth over £32 billion in 2017.
I thank the Secretary of State for that answer. Recently, we had the brilliant Ambassador for Switzerland, Ambassador Fassel, visit my constituency and looking at the potential for greater trade opportunities between our great countries. Can the Secretary of State clarify this point? He talks about continuity, and I welcome the agreement he signed. But post-Brexit trading opportunities, United Kingdom has identified United States, Australia, New Zealand and Trans-Pacific as key priorities. Can the Secretary of State clarify this? That Switzerland, with over £34 billion bilateral trade, will always be a key priority, and certainly looking forward to enhancing areas such as finance and IT.
Mr. Speaker, the countries that my honourable friend mentions are for new free trade agreements. Of course, the agreement with Switzerland was a continuity agreement. I find it was an unusual agreement because rather than being a single agreement to roll over, there were some 58 different ones, and it was to the tremendous credit of the Swiss government that they were able to carry out that work as expeditiously as they did, and we owe them a great deal of gratitude.
Mr. Barry-Sherman.
Mr. Speaker, doesn't the Minister realise that the Swiss deal is a tiny deal? Nothing wrong with it, but it's tiny. Could we have a list of all the trade deals that he's secured across the piece? Because as I've been tracking them, they're very small indeed. And can I just tell the Secretary of State, it wasn't his finest hour last night when he didn't have the courage to take an intervention from the Father of the House.
Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes one wonders how small people can actually become in this House of Commons. The Swiss deal is not small, it is not insignificant. It's worth over £32 billion a year. Switzerland is Britain's 7th biggest trading partner globally. The honourable gentleman should know that.
Yeah, I don't want to invest levity into these important proceedings, but equally one mustn't lose one's sense of humour. That £32 billion volume of trade with Switzerland is very important, but I always say the best thing about Switzerland is not its watches or its financial services or its chocolate. The best thing about Switzerland is Roger Federer. Greg Hands.
Mr. Speaker, I must say I'm tempted to actually answer questions this morning due to the new constitutional innovation of ministers no longer having to resign when they disagree with government policy. But I will ask this one, though, to my right honourable friend, and that is this, that trade with Switzerland represents about 21% of all of the trade of all of the countries that have the continuity agreement. And does he agree with me that it shows the growing success of this programme to ensure that we have those trade agreements in place in the event of a Brexit without a deal later this month?
Mr. Speaker, I half expected to see my honourable friend on the front bench with us this morning, giving the turn of events. But he's absolutely right that this is an important agreement. It's over 20% of all the trade done under EU FTAs, EU trade agreements represented by Switzerland. Mr. Speaker, it's unlike me to disagree with you, but I would wonder whether, on the morning after Roger Federer's defeated Kyle Edmund, whether it's not a touch unpatriotic to be quite so pro-Swiss.
Tom Brake.
Yeah, the Secretary of State may have heard an exchange a couple of days ago in which my right honourable friend, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, highlighted the fact that in the existing EU-Swiss trade deal, 19 technical standards have been brought in common, whereas under the current UK-EU, only UK-Swiss trade deal, only 5 technical standards have been brought in common. What assessment has he made of the impact of that on UK business?
Well, there are a number of technical interactions and some small technical issues that we shall continue to talk to the Swiss government about. Of course, the trade agreement itself is a precursor, we hope, to a further bespoke agreement as we leave the European Union.
Mr. Philip Oliver.
My understanding, Mr. Speaker, is of the 40 potential continuity agreements, 5 represent 76% of the total trade, of which Switzerland is one. Isn't this a good omen for the remaining Big Four?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, a number of those who are engaged in trade continuity discussions with the United Kingdom are waiting to see what we will do in terms of Britain's approach to the European Union. They will be much more likely to be signing up to those agreements when this House of Commons is clear about what it's going to do.
Mohammad Yasin.
Mr. Speaker.
Minister George Bollingberry.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. I just comment that I'm quite grateful for the whip on ministers having been imposed for as long as it was. Otherwise, I should not be standing here. But my credit, of course, goes to my honourable friend. When we leave the EU, we will maintain our current domestic standards. We will keep the existing UK legislation, and the EU Withdrawal Act will convert EU law into UK law as it applies at the moment of exit. This includes the regulatory regimes for environmental, food safety and animal welfare standards, and without exception, of course, imports must continue to meet all relevant UK product rules and regulations as they do today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What assessment has his department made of the impact of interim tariff measures introduced yesterday on the farming sector?
The tariff package which was announced yesterday is a balanced package. It is a temporary package. It is a putative response to the potential effects of leaving the EU without a deal. There are sectors which are vulnerable to competition from imports and are not as nimble as others and who can't change as quickly. Farming is one of those, and we believe that the balanced package we have put together will sufficiently protect farming interests in the UK.
Mr. Desmond Swain.
If regulatory alignment with the EU is maintained in these goods, to what extent will that constrain our ambitions for wider trade deals?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. Of course, if the Prime Minister's deal is passed through this House in its third iteration, it provides for regulatory alignment not to continue, and therefore we will be able to pursue trade deals internationally. Of course, we can, in any event, do so, since not all of trade deals are to do with goods.
Tim Farron.
Speaker, during the BSE crisis of the 90s and the foot-and-mouth outbreak of 2001 and the scare of 2007, even some members of the European Union took advantage of these crises to ban British meat imports, even long after any risk had expired. If we leave with a bad deal, such as the one that Parliament has now rejected twice, countries won't need an excuse to act with opportunistic protectionism in that way. So how will we make sure that those countries, our farmers, are protected in the deals that we strike going forward?
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And of course, the honourable gentleman has real constituency concerns on this interest, I'm sure. The simple fact is the UK intends to operate within the WTO and subscribe to the world's rules-based order on trade, and that gives us a great deal of protection. We are always able to bring disputes if we feel that WTO rules are being flouted inappropriately.
Bill Esterson.
In the United States, pork is produced using ractopamine, which causes heart disease, and it's not treated for trichinosis, which can lead to stomach upset. The United States National Pork Producers Council wants its standards included in the US-UK trade deal, and they have the support of their government in this demand. This threat to food safety is completely unacceptable. So will the Minister rule out any reduction in food standards in international trade agreements?
I would like just to repeat, if I may, Mr. Speaker, what we have said from this dispatch box and this department many, many times is that we absolutely agree with the honourable gentleman. Our food standards should be maintained. As to the requirements that the United States has laid out in its provisional negotiating strategy for its agreement with the United Kingdom, if the honourable gentleman looks carefully at previous such agreements and previous such outline mandates for the United States, he will find that they are almost exactly the same in every respect. That does not mean to say that they are delivered in that form.
Sandy Martin.
Number 3, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker, the government is considering its future approach to investor-state dispute settlement. Where included in a trade agreement, ISDS will not oblige the government to open the NHS to further competition, and overseas companies will not be able to take legal action to force us to do so.
Andy Martin.
The Secretary of State did not rule out the use of legal action against other companies in this country. So what message would the Minister of the Secretary of State give to all of those idealistic people who voted leave to the European Union because they thought that TTIP would open us up to hostile lawsuits from the United States companies? And does he think that now that the truth is out, they ought to have a chance for another vote?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure what the connection was between some of those points. Let me just be very clear that through ISDS, investment claims can only be made in respect of established investments. It cannot be used in relation to an alleged failure to open up public services to a potential investor. It couldn't be much clearer that what was being put about was a complete myth.
Yes, very well. Dr. David Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But what guarantees can the Secretary of State give us that pharmaceutical companies will not relocate to the EU, which means that we are effectively seeing the import of more and more of our drugs? Can you give a guarantee that will not happen?
Mr. Speaker, it would be absolutely ridiculous of any minister to try to tell businesses what they can and cannot do. But what I can tell them is that last year foreign direct investment into the United Kingdom rose by 20%. In continental Europe it fell by 73%. Draw your own conclusions.
Hosey.
During the recent debate on international trade, I cited two examples of where the Canadian government had to withdraw public health measures after legal challenges by businesses under the terms of the NAFTA Free Trade Agreement. So can I ask the Secretary of State, when he's looking at health protections in future UK FTAs, can we ensure they go wider than direct NHS provision and ensure they encompass wider public health policy?
Well, we'll look to replicate the success we've already had in bilateral investment treaties. UK investors have brought around 70 cases successfully against other governments. No private company has ever brought a successful case against the United Kingdom in our bilateral investment treaties.
Judith Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the British public are very clear on this. They do not want our National Health Service to be bargained away as part of trade negotiations. And they do not want foreign companies to have the right to sue our government for decisions taken in the interests of public health. Yet this is exactly what could happen if we accept ISDS and the negative list approaches in the future agreements that this government is proposing. So will the Secretary of State now rule out agreeing to a single clause of a single trade deal that could threaten our NHS?
Well, there are days when I genuinely have to thank God that the Labour Party are the opposition and not the government of this country. We have 1.3 trillion outward in stock invested, including things like pension funds that British people will depend upon for their prosperity. If we were to abandon the concept of investor-state dispute resolutions, what would happen to the protections for our investment overseas? The Labour Party need to start thinking about the wider interests of this country.
Ronnie Cowan.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 4 together with questions 7 and 9. Existing EU trade agreements such as the EU-Canada CETA agreement and the EU-Japan agreement contain provisions ensuring that it remains for the United Kingdom to decide how our public services are run. As we leave the EU, the government will ensure that all future trade agreements continue to protect the UK's right to regulate public services.
But technically, there's very little that MPs and the public can do to prevent this government from signing trade deals that could negatively impact the NHS. Can the Secretary of State assure this House that he will expand the transparency and the scrutiny mechanisms pertaining to any future trade deals?
Good question.
Mr. Speaker, I recommend the Government's command paper on this issue, which we published last week, setting out the scrutiny plans, which will provide greater scrutiny in this country than most of our fellow countries in the European Union.
Annalisa Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Conservative ministers chose to include the NHS within their approach to TTIP, which could have made it impossible to bring privatised NHS services back in-house. He'll know that privatisation is proceeding apace in the NHS. It certainly is in my constituency with our cancer scanning services. So will he give us a cast-iron legal guarantee? That's what we will need to show that his government is committed to excluding the NHS from future trade deals. Thank you.
Where do we start? First of all, this government didn't negotiate TTIP. The European Union negotiated TTIP on behalf of this country, so it wasn't for the United Kingdom to determine the mandate. Nonetheless, Mr. Speaker, if I can just say to the Honourable Lady, if she looks at the agreements that are already out there, CETA, for example, Chapter 9, Article 9.2, talks about services are excluded services those in the exercise of governmental authority. It is quite clear from what the government included in the CETA ratification that we intend to give provision to ensure that governments have the right to regulate public services. I think that's a good idea. Therefore, I can't understand why the Labour Party voted against it.
Jay Platt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has publicly stated that he supports CETA as a model for future trade agreements, an agreement which prevents future governments from tackling the failed privatisation agenda, both in our health and transport services. Does the Secretary of State agree that trade agreements cannot be allowed to constrain future policy decisions?
I don't know where that briefing came from, but the Honourable Lady should ask for her money back, because there's nothing in CETA that stops government regulating its own public services. That is specifically what the exclusion is for. And it is in the interests of this country that we do get government regulation of our own public services, so we can have proper scrutiny, including through this House. That's what's included in the agreement.
Kevin Foster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last year I saw firsthand how the New Zealand Parliament handles the scrutiny of trade agreements to ensure they both deliver for their economy and ensure key public services are protected. What learning and reassurance is my right honourable friend taking from the experiences of the New Zealand Parliament in scrutinising trade deals done and making sure they deliver the promised benefits?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have looked widely at what other countries are doing, particularly where there are similar legislatures and similar legal systems. But what we have set out in the command paper is a bespoke arrangement for the United Kingdom. For example, our consultation period is longer than the European Union because we thought it was right to have increased scrutiny in the UK. But it's a UK policy made for the UK.
Tim Lawton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government announced details yesterday of the temporary tariff in a written ministerial statement to the House. This is a balanced tariff policy that aims to minimise costs to businesses and mitigate price impacts on consumers, while also, of course, supporting UK producers as far as possible.
Tim Lawton.
The details are being published at last, and I notice that slippers are going to be charged at 17% less under these tariffs, and perhaps given the disorientation of certain of his ministerial colleagues last night, some might like to invest in a pair and retire early. But on a more important point, can we, going forward, get away from the obscene nonsense where in the past we've given money in international aid to countries like Ethiopia to encourage cocoa farmers to produce agricultural products, quite rightly, only then obscenely for the EU to charge them tariffs of 30% when they try to sell the products of their hard labour back to us?
The honourable gentleman is, of course, quite right that one of the parts of the temporary arrangements which we are putting in place is to recognise that there are developing countries with whom we have agreements and with whom we have long supported, who require access to our markets tariff-free to ensure that they can sustain themselves through trade. That's why there is a programme, there are sections within this proposal that keeps tariffs up on certain lines to allow those countries to preferentially access the UK market to their advantage.
Adrian Bailey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The National Farmers Union are profoundly concerned about the fact that they only have 2 weeks to prepare for the new tariff regime, particularly in view of the fact that cereals and egg producers will have no protection whatsoever. What discussions has the Minister had with the appropriate ministers in other departments to ensure support and compensation for those farmers?
Of course, the farming community is protected by a commitment to the payments they were expecting out through 2020. We consulted widely with colleagues across government, as the Honourable Gentleman would know and expect. This is a collectively agreed decision. We have placed tariffs on quite large numbers of vulnerable agricultural products, and we hope that the mix together is the right decision, not just for the producers, but also for consumers. I should remind the House that for those in the bottom 10 percentage points of income in this country, food is a very real cost every single day. Some 20% of their incomes are spent on food weekly. If we allowed inflation to roar away on products of this sort, people would find, at that end of the income scale, would find it very hard to feed themselves, and we believe we have to mitigate for that as well as the incomes of farmers.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of my constituents work in the fish processing industry in the Grimsby-Cleethorpes area, and the supply of fish from Iceland is essential to them. Can the Minister give an assurance that no decisions on tariffs will be detrimental to those supplies?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are on 2 points. First, we have transitioned the free trade agreements that the EU had with the Faroes, something that members opposite have actually derided us about as to the scale of the deal. Of course, to certain communities, particularly in the honourable members' parts of the world, those fish products are extremely important to keep people in work and keep feeding the country. And secondly, we are having extensive discussions with the EFTA countries and EEA countries about transitioning a free trade deal, and we would hope to be able to bring some news on this forward to the House in due course.
Just yesterday, the trade arrangements were announced trade agreements between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and they give us some concessions. However, the Ulster Farmers Union have indicated that they have some concerns over the arrangements that have been made. Can the Minister indicate what discussions he's had with the Ulster Farmers Union in Northern Ireland to discuss this?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Gentleman, I know, identifies an extremely important issue. I'm not going to sidestep the question. I will give him an answer, but of course, in the end, this is a matter for DEXU and indeed for the government more widely. There is no doubt that the choices that have been made for the position on the border in Northern Ireland were made against an extraordinarily difficult backdrop. There were no easy decisions. This decision we have made is temporary. We believe it is WTO compliant. We recognise that there are real difficulties, and yes, I spoke with the agricultural community in Northern Ireland just yesterday and explained this. They, whilst very disturbed by what was going to happen, understood why the decision had been taken.
Order. Topical questions. Will Quince. Answer.
Mr. Speaker, my department is responsible for foreign and outward direct investment, establishing an independent trade policy and export promotion. Following this session, I will be signing the trade continuity agreement between the UK and the Pacific Islands in the event of no deal. This is part of our commitment to reduce poverty through trade and will ensure continued supply of key consumer products.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a lot of scaremongering on this issue. It's concerning a number of my constituents. So could the Secretary of State set out what steps the government is taking to ensure contracts for the delivery of NHS services will be excluded from future trade deals?
Mr. Speaker, as I have already said, the Government will ensure that all future trade agreements continue to protect the United Kingdom's right to regulate public services. It could not be simpler, and any attempts to distort that basic message are political propaganda and they are untrue.
Barry Gardner.
Thanks, sir. One of our most distinguished former diplomats, the noble Lord Kerr, spoke last week during the passage of the trade bill in another place of the value of having a mandate as a negotiator. He said, having negotiated against the Americans, I know that it greatly strengthens their hand to be able to say, here is the proof I cannot give you what you want, because Congress would turn it down. Recently, the US Trade Representative published the negotiating mandate for a US-UK trade deal. No concern about commercial confidentiality here, just openly and transparently setting out all the objectives they have for penetrating UK markets with American healthcare and agribusiness to the fore. The same week, the Secretary of State published his command paper. It is against mandates. Indeed, the government tried unsuccessfully to defeat Lord Kerr and others who supported Lord Balmacara's amendment. What is it that the Secretary of State knows about negotiations that Lord Kerr does not? And will the government try to reverse their lordship's decision when the bill returns to the Commons?
Mr. Speaker, the trade bill is about trade continuity, including our trade agreements, including the TRA. It has been used, I'm afraid, in the other place to hold debates on future trade agreements, which will come in due course here. There is, of course, a difference between setting out negotiating objectives, which the United States did, and a mandate, which is how the negotiators actually go about it. It seems that the honourable gentleman hasn't grasped that point yet.
T.C. Davis.
Speaker, would my honourable friend agree with me that the enormous investment into Britain by the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund shows that with or without a deal, this country is one of the best places in the world to do business? And if he does agree, could he draw this to attention of some of his colleagues in the Cabinet?
I thank my honourable friend for his question. He's quite right. The world's largest sovereign wealth fund has said it's going to continue its investment here. And of course, the latest figures from UNCTAD show that the UK strengthened its position last year as the #1 foreign direct investment destination in Europe, and the hundreds of thousands of jobs and the higher wages that result would be threatened by the party opposite if they got the chance to jack up corporation tax rates and put in place other business-unfriendly policies, and that would reverse the investment that's brought so much good to this country since Labour left in 2010.
UK food businesses such as Devro plc in my constituency benefit from free trade with the EU and its free trade agreements with third countries. So can the Secretary of State confirm how long it will take his department to negotiate new agreements with these third countries, and will be in the same terms as we currently enjoy through our EU membership?
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, the government's policy is that we don't have to have these agreements in terms of rollover, because we want to get an agreement through this House so that we can continue with the Prime Minister's plan. If the honourable gentleman wants to help the businesses he mentions, he can vote for the Prime Minister's agreement at the next opportunity.
Nigel Havelston.
Mr. Speaker, an area of international trade often overlooked is tourism, and of course inbound tourism is export earnings. What is the department doing in terms of discussions with other government departments to boost our tourism industry in areas such as looking at visas?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my honourable friend is absolutely right. And tourism is a great example, and I use the word great advisedly, because the great brand is used across the whole of UK government. It's that rarest of thing, joined-up government policy that actually works. It's added huge value to our tourism sector, and in 2017 we saw record numbers of visitors to the UK and a contribution to the UK economy of £24 billion.
Douglas Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just wondering that given the inevitable downturn that will come from any kind of Brexit that we end up with, what consideration has the Minister given to the introduction of free ports in order to boost economic activity in low economic areas of performance just now?
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for the interest he's shown in this issue. I think that the ability to look at the experience of other countries and what they have done with free ports and their ability to increase economic activity is a very valuable one. It's something the government is considering and considering in a very optimistic and positive way.
Mark Prisk.
Speaker, the UK Export Finance does some excellent work, but some of its funding capacity goes unused. What can be done to change that to raise British exports?
Mr. Speaker, we have signed an MOU with the banks, the 5 biggest banks, so that they can encourage businesses to utilise UK export finance. One of the main areas where it's underutilised is with small businesses. But the positive sign is that last year, over 70% of the agreements signed by UKF were with small businesses. That's a trend that we would like to see continue.
Stuart C. MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, over 20,000 people, including many of my constituents, have signed the Fair Trade Fortnight petition calling on the government to lead action on exploitative rates of pay in the hugely valuable international cocoa trade. Will the government take up that challenge?
Mr. Speaker, I would like to take the opportunity to praise the work of the Fair Trade Organisation, which is so well led and coordinated by my very good friend Lord Price. Yes, it is essential that we look at these issues because free trade is not a free-for-all. There need to be rules around it and there needs to be fair trade. And the government will look very sympathetically at what the honourable gentleman suggests.
David Amis. On the visit of the Taiwanese representative and the Philippine ambassador, does my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the announcement that the Qatari ambassador, together with a trade delegation, will be visiting Southend on the 25th of March as we move towards city status, as they explore the opportunities of trade and business investment as we leave the European Union?
I welcome the announcement by Qatar's ambassador to the UK, His Excellency Mr Yusuf Al-Khater, and his accompanying delegation to visit Southend, Mr Speaker. And I'm pleased to say that the UK is one of Qatar's major investment destinations globally, with more than £35 billion already invested in the UK.
Sharon Lee.
Speaker, if the United States lift their suspension of Title III of the Helms-Burton legislation, which gives US citizens the right to sue foreign companies for using Cuban nationalised properties, British businesses which trade with Cuba will suffer damaging consequences. What discussions has the Secretary of State had with our international partners to coordinate a response to the proposed changes in US extraterritorial policies that impact on businesses trading with Cuba?
Everywhere but Lincoln.
Mr Speaker, it's an issue that the government takes seriously because we will want to ensure that British companies have the right to trade where we think it is appropriate and where the British government's foreign policy indicates that. And I have had and will continue to have discussions with my American counterparts on that issue.
Nick Dakin.
Mr Speaker, what progress is being made given the announcement on tariffs that regarding the steel industry, the trade defence instruments in place at European level are transferred across to UK level at the point of departure?
Mr Speaker, I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman missed the statement that we had in the House on this, but I made it very clear that those arrangements would be rolled over. It will not be the government's intention in any way, shape or form to leave our businesses less protected than they are today, which is why those trade remedies will continue.